Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Ethicsverse, the coolest place to be every Thursday at noon Eastern. If you care about making your company better, we have an awesome episode for you today. We're talking about behind the scenes of risk assessments, the beautiful, brutal truth with Rebecca Walker and Amy Bernard-Bon. So before we jump in, we got a couple of great announcements. As always, drop your LinkedIn URL into the chat, and we challenge you to connect with at least one person today. Remember, your network is your net worth. Neither are big enough. And the key to your success in your job is expanding that network. You know, we have a very collegial community, and there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. You don't get bonus points for reinventing the wheel. So odds are there's somebody on this webinar today that is going through a challenge, or that has gone through a challenge that you might be going through right now. And reaching out will never come back void. I guarantee it. So tell us where you're from today. Remember, we feed off of emojis. Those are better than coffee for us. So if we say something great or funny, drop that in there and let us know what's resonating with you. Here's our link tree. So if you hold your phone up and hit this QR code, you're going to come to a page that has a bunch of links for us. Check out our YouTube channel. All the best, all of our webinars, all of our podcasts are on there. All the best clips are put up there as shorts. You can follow us on LinkedIn, where we also put all the best highlights from our weekly webinar episodes and from our podcast. And you can follow me on LinkedIn as well. We also, let me move this here. Today's prizes. We're giving away the one and only PI guidebook. So this is a book that Amy Bernard-Bon wrote. Round of applause for Amy. This book is really phenomenal. Amy is a master at coaching and career advancement, and this book is chock full of phenomenal exercises to really do some introspection and figure out where you might be slipping and where you can improve to really expand your impact in your organization. So we are going to be giving away 5 of those today. Pardon me. Giving away 5 of those today. If I go back real quick, if you don't want to participate because you're such a introvert, even behind the scenes, you can hit this QR code and go ahead and pick that up. This is going to be a phenomenal thing to add to your library. I really can't recommend it enough. So we're giving away 5 of those. So drop those questions in, keep those tips coming. You know, risk assessments are a great area for us to improve on and use strategically, which we'll be getting into. So keep those comments and keep those questions coming. Compliance Week is coming up. We have launched our page. I've been talking about this for weeks. There are a ton of phenomenal exercises and activities that you can put to work in your program. So maybe we can drop that into the chat right now, or if you guys are interested in that, we're going to have a roundtable on 9/19. So go ahead and drop a zero in the chat if you're interested in joining that roundtable, where we're really going to get down to the nuts and bolts of how to make your Compliance Week really successful, how you can get creative with it. We have this misconduct mystery game, which we are editing the video for, so you guys can use this as well. This is a lot of fun, and it's a game to, you know, it's a kind of a fun game to get some interaction and find out who the bad guy is and reinforce some of our policies around bribes and so forth. Here's a sneak peek of the video that's coming out. That's me and Jack with our, these are the characters that we were playing in the video, so stay tuned for that. And so the Compliance Week Roundtable, like I said, drop a 0 in the chat if you'd like to join us on September 19th, where we're going to be diving deep. Someone from our team will reach out and invite you to join. That's going to be a really fun tactical, session together. We are still giving away these benchmark reports, these custom benchmark reports. We typically give these to clients, but you know, if you're part of the Ethicsverse, you're part of the family here, okay? So join the Ethicsverse to get eligible for this, and drop a 1 in the chat if you'd like us to put together a custom benchmark report, which gets your, takes your data, benchmarks it against our data, against the status quo data out there, and gives you some really great actionable tips to improve. You know, it'll be a nice PDF that you can share with your team or share with the audit committee or whatever. The ecosystem is ripping through our industry. We're getting so much great feedback on that. So there should be a link on the page if you'd like to see what's out there. You know, a next-gen ethics and compliance platform can really help you build some more efficiency and really unlock some heads. You know, a lot of folks struggle with the budget that they want and they don't have enough heads and so forth. And what we found is that a lot of compliance teams are bloated because the tools that they're using aren't really working for them. So when you can cut your work in half by connecting to other tools, not having to kind of run through the mud, you can usually move over and get, you can get extra, work on those important non-urgent issues that are really going to advance your program. So check out the ecosystem if you're interested, just to see what's out there. Of course, as always, a leave your wallet, leave your purse at home demo. I want to talk about a couple of other books that are out. Our friend Tom Fox launched this book. Speaking Up is Awesome. This is a great book if you're in ethics and compliance to explain to your children early the value in speaking up. I had a podcast last week with a gentleman, Professor Palma from the Fordham School, and he said his number one piece of advice that he wished he had earlier was learning to speak up early and often. So this is a great book. Hit that QR code there and pick that up. Mary's book is doing great. It's a bestseller on Amazon. If you don't have this yet, again, participate today, and you can be eligible to pick a book from our library. But this book has been really great. 65 massive tips to improve your program. So I encourage you to pick that up. And our friend Adam Balfour, who was on last week, his book just launched officially this week. So if you haven't picked that up or you didn't win last week, spend a couple of bucks on yourself to improve. If you're not doing something to improve, you're going to kind of stay where you're at. And this book is all about, ethics and compliance for humans, how you can humanize your program and make that more resonant to drive the influence, which is really what the name of our game is. Next week, we have Ronnie on and the gentleman from Yum Brands to talk about how they revamped the Yum compliance program. And we're going to talk about some tactical techniques to improve your own brand and some things you might be able to change to, again, drive that improvement and drive that influence and participation in the organization. And then the following week, we are doing the quantum leap of ethics, preparing for ethics and compliance for tomorrow's tech. So stay tuned on that. Let me introduce our esteemed panel today. Rebecca Walker and Amy Bernard-Bahn are partners at the law firm of Kaplan & Walker, the law firm that specializes in compliance law. This is like the compliance law practice. I'm telling you, if you guys don't know these guys, you should sign up for their newsletter. There's great thought leadership in there, but I'm sure you've seen these guys all over LinkedIn, all over the conferences, because they have so many great insights to add. So over the last 20 years, Kaplan & Walker has helped hundreds of compliance design companies design compliance programs that are tailored to the legal risk and business needs that are applicable to the government standards. The firm's partners have also served as monitors and independent consultants, reviewing compliance programs for the Department of Justice, the Security and Exchange Commission, the World Bank, and the Department of the Air Force and other enforcement bodies. And Kaplan Walker is a majority-owned women business. So, guys, welcome. Round of applause for Rebecca and Amy. How do you guys like my wig? Huh? How do you like my new? I'm experimenting with some new hairstyles. How do you like that?
I love it. It looks very Owen Wilson.
Oh, thank you. Interestingly, I've been working on my Owen Wilson. I've been working on my Owen Wilson impression. I'll work. Here's the QR code for the Kaplan & Walker newsletter that I just mentioned. Absolutely sign up for that. If you have to sharpen the saw, and there's so much great thought leadership out there, and Kaplan and Walker are among the best. So I'll leave this up for a quick sec. Hit that QR code and sign up for that. Okay, let's dive into our slides. So today we're talking about ethics and compliance risk assessments and what the foundation of an effective C&E program is. So Amy, I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome. We are so happy to be here today, and thank you for the really cool avatars, Nick. We love those. Rebecca and I are going to have to find outfits like that for the SCCE conference in Chicago. So today we are here to talk about risk assessment, and this is something that is probably near and dear to everyone's hearts. It's really a foundation of an effective C&E program, gives you an opportunity to check in on kind of where you're at in your progress. So moving along today, we're going to first talk about why do you do this? Why do we spend so much time and effort on risk assessment? So what do you get out of it? The first thing is you learn whether you're using your program resources efficiently, which is critical because we all know we never get as many resources as we think we want or need. So that's important. Second, you can get a broad-based contribution to the program. When you have this opportunity to have organizational attention and focus on risk assessment, you get greater buy-in for the program, and then you can make program improvements. It's a way to really deeply touch base with your key stakeholders and operational partners. Third is you can rationalize your program components. You can check in and get a data check on, is this working well? You can get that for you, for senior leadership, and most importantly, for your board. And then the fourth is we need to do it. Legal guidance places great importance on risk assessments. And in a few minutes, my partner Rebecca is going to talk about the foundation for those. Rebecca, why don't you take this one?
Thank you, Amy. And first of all, I just want to say thank you to Nick for having us on today. I've been in this field for, longer than I will admit. Kaplan and Walker has been around for almost 20 years now, and I was practicing in the field well before that. But I finally feel like I'm kind of cool because Nick gave me this avatar. I'm on this webinar with you, Nick, and you definitely have elevated the cool factor of the field generally and of me personally by having me on. So
I'm glad everyone's finally catching up because you've been pretty cool for a while.
Delighted to be here. But back to risk assessment, which is such an important topic, as Amy said. And there are so many reasons to conduct risk assessments that have nothing to do with what the Sentencing Commission has said or the Justice Department has said. It really just makes sense and allows us to rationalize our program. But we also, of course, in this field, have to pay some attention to what the Justice Department says and what the Sentencing Commission says. So just wanted to point out here that there's a lot of guidance on the importance of risk assessment. And the key takeaways are that this risk assessment periodically. It should not be a snapshot in time. So it needs to be both periodic and to some extent continuous, right? As things happen in our organization, we shouldn't wait 2 years for the next risk assessment to factor that into the training that we do and the communications that we do and the audits that we do. We really need to have a mindset of continuous assessment and modification of our programs in light of what we're seeing in the world and what we're seeing in our own organizations. I think that's something that's sort of the most important part of risk assessment and something that we don't think about enough because we tend to step back and think about the process. How many folks are we interviewing? How many documents are we reviewing? What does the risk assessment report look like? This pretty red, yellow, and green graphs. But the truth is that we are all doing risk assessments every day in our compliance work, right? Every day when you're thinking about what communication to send next month or what training to do for this group of employees, that's risk assessment work. You're thinking about risk and basing your program strategies on that. And that's also what the Justice Department and the Sentencing Commission and other enforcement officials and regulators expect. So it needs to be continuous. It also needs to be periodic. And your program needs to be based on the work that you're doing there.
Frank just jumped in and said, for those of you who might be studying for the CHC exam, remember, tie in what you hear today to what is referenced in risk assessments as described in 8B2.1. There is a definite tie-in. So thanks for that tip, Frank. Keep going, please.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is, interestingly, the original edition, this is going to age me again. The original version of the sentencing guidelines didn't spend quite as much time talking about risk assessment. We all sort of assumed that was part of what what a compliance program should look like. When the guidelines were revised in 2004 and again in 2010, there was an enhanced focus on risk assessment. And it's because sort of as a profession, we began to understand the value of assessing risks and basing our program on those. So all important reasons to think about risk assessment, both from a practical perspective and from a listening to the government regulators and enforcement officials perspective. Also, Delaware case law has really enhanced the focus on risk assessment for compliance practitioners because there's a real focus in the case law on the importance of a board understanding and overseeing the compliance program from a risk-based perspective. So since the Caremark decision by the Delaware Chancery Court in 1996, we have known that there's some potential liability for directors for the misconduct that occurs at organizations if directors have failed to oversee the organization's compliance program. That was an important decision in Caremark, but there wasn't a lot of follow-up to that. in 2019, the Delaware Supreme Court decided the case of Marchand versus Barnhill, in which it said, yes, directors can be liable for misconduct of the organization if they fail to oversee the compliance program generally, and this is the important part from our perspective this morning, if directors fail to oversee the company's compliance controls in significant risk areas, in mission critical risk areas. So there's an expectation from the courts that directors will oversee the compliance program generally and oversee the compliance program as it relates to the most important risk areas. Just emphasizing the need for risk assessment and for briefing the board and senior leadership on risk assessment. Last year, the McDonald's case, it was earlier this year, the Delaware court specifically extended that Caremark potential liability to executive officers if executive officers fail to oversee the company's compliance efforts, and in particular in mission critical risk areas. So again, really important to conduct regular risk assessments from the perspective of ensuring that you are supporting your board's ability to oversee the compliance program and senior leadership's ability to oversee the compliance program.
So let's talk about that for a second, because I don't know if that's top of mind for every single board. I mean, there are people on this call that have boards, there are billion-dollar companies. There are people on this call that have, 1,000-person companies, 500-person companies. And depending on the board's level of sophistication, this may or may not be on their radar as like a top priority. What advice would you give to, you just mentioned it's our job to brief the board and sort of enable them. How can we better empower the board to, recognize that this risk is out there for them as per this case law, and kind of serve up the information that they need so that they're equipped, they're empowered, and we're at the same time showing our sort of strategic value to the organization?
Yeah, it's such an important question, I think, Nick, and this is something that comes up a lot in our practice. The board might not understand. I mean, in the Boeing case, for example, the Delaware court found that the Boeing company board of directors had not adequately overseen the company's compliance program and allowed that case to continue, passed a motion to dismiss. So this is a very sophisticated company with a very sophisticated compliance program, right, but there was not compliance, board oversight of compliance in the area of airplane safety, which the court said was a mission critical risk area, of course, to a company that manufactures airplanes. So even in this most sophisticated setting, the Delaware court said, you know what, more should have been done. So really important to continue to educate our boards about the potential liability here, and it's their potential liability, and about the need to stay on top of their oversight efforts. They need to be briefed on what's going on with the compliance program. They need to be briefed on the risk assessment so that they understand what the mission critical risk areas are. I think the only thing we can do is just continue to provide that information and training to our boards. I will tell you, I'm in the middle of a risk assessment. Amy and I are in the middle of a risk assessment now, and we got pushback from one of the senior leaders about our desire to interview the chair of the audit committee for the purposes of conducting this assessment. And it was an opportunity. It was a little frustrating, but an important opportunity for us to also educate senior leadership about the role of the board and what the Delaware courts have said, and the Department of Justice and other regulators said about the importance of robust board oversight. For boards to exercise robust oversight, they have to understand the organization's compliance risk profile, which is part of the reason we conduct a risk assessment, right? We have to understand it ourselves, and we have to brief the board and senior leadership on that.
So how did that conversation go? Like, was there a light bulb moment for this individual? Did the pushback evaporate away? And how were you tactically able to drive that forward by using some of these case law examples to show the magnitude of the issue here, right?
Yeah. Well, that's exactly what I did. I used the case law examples. I used Justice Department guidance. I used precedents. I used our own practice as precedent as well, because we always interview the chair of the relevant board committee. And so to have an aberration in this particular case, I think would stand out. So there were lots of, it was sort of making a legal argument to some extent. I felt like I was there just sort of, putting forth all of the different arguments I could muster and trying to move the needle on that. So that's, I mean, it really was a back and forth and just a push to get to where I felt like we needed to be.
That's good. Yeah, I think like in order to have that push, we have to have the confidence, and this case law is a great confidence source because we have some tangible examples of where there have been failures that have led to folks getting their finger caught in the machine, so to speak. And we're just, I talk about this a lot, but like we just can't be passive. Like ethics and compliance is not this passive role. We have to be very active, and we're inevitably going to hit impediments, and some of those impediments are, I'd say most of those impediments are usually due to, ignorance, not arrogance. And we have to be able to push through those things to make sure that everybody's on the same page about the importance of our function and what we're supposed to be doing. Until that blockage is removed, we can never be the circulatory system of the organization, which is what kind of the healthiest ethics and compliance programs that I see are to their companies.
Extraordinarily well put, Nick. And I think you're right. I mean, best case scenario, it is ignorance, not arrogance, right? And so we just have to be a source of knowledge and try to handhold through that educational opportunity and hope for the best.
Anything to add to that, Amy? You're a master of internal persuasion, and we can keep going. Of course, I know we're going to get into this some more later, but I just feel like this is such a sticking point for a lot of folks, where they don't feel like they can sort of influence the board at that level, and sometimes they kind of dim their light a little bit.
I think that most executives don't want to be the outlier, especially in a compliance and legal case. So of course the case law is important and that kind of thing, but I think it's more important to appeal to their sense of, hey, this is a best practice. We're going to look funny. Do you want to be the one person, the one company that didn't look at this area and that didn't engage the board, because that's dangerous. And then you can go back to the case law. But I think making the personal point of this is what well-run companies do. I would speak their language a little bit more. Of course, again, you can have the legal for the backup. It depends on who you're talking to. But if you're talking to someone who's not a lawyer, that kind of thing, I think that can be helpful.
And if I can just underscore something that you just said, and I'm getting a little tactical here, but like the basis for persuasion is controlling the conversation. And the only way that we can control the conversation is through questions. And if you listen to what Amy just said, she said, do you want to be that outlier? Do you want to be that person that, is sort of the negative example? It was something like that. Asking that kind of a question really opens the mind up on a subconscious level and lets them consider, oh my gosh, what would happen for me? Again, appealing to their self-interest. What would happen to me for my reputation or for my career if this happened? That sort of opens the gates to the castle, so to speak, so that your support, whether it's this case law or, whatever the basis for your argument is, can really get in. So really, Amy, you're a real master at like the use of those questions. But if we're not asking questions in those kinds of conversations, many times we're going to feel like we're beating our head against the wall. Okay. Speaking of beating things to death here, we can move on. Sorry, I just think that this is such an important such an important piece to unleash,
Yeah. Thank you. Great. So now we're just going to go over the basic 6 steps to a risk assessment. This is the methodology that Rebecca and I use for our clients. The first is determine the scope, and I'm going to let Rebecca go into that in a bit of detail later, because it's a really important initial framing to decide. Very, very important preliminary decision. Then the second is document and information review. So we collect a lot of different documents, request policies, procedures, SOPs, all kinds of training samples, all kinds of things like that regarding the 8 elements. Then we conduct interviews. And then some of our clients, we also help them with launching a survey, which is a supplemental deep dive into certain areas that may have popped up or that may be red flagged. So happy to talk about that if folks have questions. Focus groups is another area where you can get greater granularity. If you already know that there's an area that you're really curious about, or maybe there's a geography in the world, maybe you did an acquisition, that's a great opportunity, especially if you don't have a big footprint over there with your compliance and ethics staff, to do a focus group and get a little deeper. So that's another add-on that can be helpful. And then, of course, the report out is really important. So also want to talk about, go ahead.
If we can go back. You mentioned these surveys and questionnaires and focus groups. And I'd like to hear some examples of like where you've seen folks really hit it out of the park and where those sort of have fallen flat, or like what are some good techniques for constructing those surveys and questionnaires, or building out those focus groups. Where do we focus? How do we drive that forward?
Rebecca, do you have one that comes to mind?
Sure. So there are a couple different ways to approach it. With respect to surveys, we often look at the sort of typical employee engagement type survey data of comfort level speaking up, perception of the same types of things you would look at for a program assessment, perception of senior leadership support for the compliance program, those types of things that help us understand the culture of compliance at the organization. Or if, for example, we're dealing with a client who we know has some significant corruption risk in certain parts of the world, we might ask some very specific questions of appropriate folks. We wouldn't ask this of everyone at the organization, but specific questions about the engagement of third parties, dealing with government officials, hiring of the relatives of government officials, some very specific questions related to a particular risk area. And that would vary, of course, depending on the client and our knowledge of the client's risks at a more general level. And similarly for the questionnaires. For focus groups, those become a little more ERM style, enterprise risk management style, in terms of getting a group of folks together and just brainstorming about legal and compliance risks. And that, is similar to what you would see in an enterprise risk management group process.
Great, thank you.
That's a perfect segue into ERM. So what is the relationship of compliance and ethics risk assessment to enterprise risk management? So there's plenty of overlap in concept and in practice. And we all know that synergies can exist, particularly with respect to employee interviews. So for example, if you have an ERM function, or if your organization is about to do an ERM review, you definitely want to align with them so that you don't get interview fatigue and don't unwittingly lose some political capital over asking for executive time. So that can happen. So make sure that you're in communications with that. But we do find, and I found this as well in my various companies in-house, that when ERM kind of tries to handle compliance and ethics, it can be suboptimal. Personally, I don't recommend it. I don't think it gets enough attention. They're eating an elephant, It's insane what is in an enterprise risk assessment, and it's really important. But we know that compliance and ethics risks deserve their own deeper assessment. And so some of the compliance and ethics risks may not be significant enough to warrant a lot of attention if you are embedded in an ERM process. So that's tough. I know that potentially happened to me, and I had to really fight to kind of get out of the ERM and say, let's not include this in your scope, please, and let me do this in a year. So that was something that I might recommend, depending on your organization and how mature your compliance and ERM functions are. The ERM process doesn't usually include the level of granularity, and we'll be talking about the importance of granularity in meeting both standards and actual results in our programs. So to have a really robust risk assessment process for CNA, you really usually don't want it embedded in ERM. They just have too much of the elephant to eat there. And the ERM process may not be focused on mitigation the same way that compliance and ethics risk is. They just don't necessarily have the same approach to risk and best practices that we know in compliance for our risk areas. Any thoughts or questions about that, Nick?
I think the point that you're making is that ERM it's not as nuanced, and it might not understand the nuance of or the intricacies of the type of compliance risks that somebody with the compliance lens might be able to recognize. And their focus, would you say that their focus, this is a broad brushstroke, which is all I seem to paint with, but their focus is really more about identifying the risks, where our focus is to identify and mitigate those risks in an effective way?
Yes, because they're talking about everything from I don't know, even financial risk, market risk. They're looking at a bunch of other macroeconomic issues, geopolitical issues, supply chain. They may be looking at entirely different set, and it's on a broad strategic level, I would say, as opposed to the doing level that we know we can actually do something about it. Some of the risks they look at, they put them out there and they might be in their 10K, but they're not actually going to be able to do anything about them.
That's actually an important point. A geopolitical risk, for example, that is just, the mandate is to just identify it, right? I mean, what are you going to do about something that's happening in Russia or whatever? The things we're trying to find are things that, to your point, we can actually do to de-risk the organization. I'd love you guys to comment on this question from Allison. Allison, thanks for, or this comment from Allison. So she said, I provide quarterly reports to the board and have a dotted line reporting to them. In the 5 years I've been in this organization, I've only been invited to the board meeting once. It's very frustrating. Even my training for the board, I'm not allowed to do in person. What do what advice would you give somebody who's in that situation? Because I don't think that's that uncommon. How can that person sort of change that scenario that they're living out?
So, Allison, that is a fabulous question. And Nick's right. It happens. I mean, if it makes you feel better, it does happen frequently, I'm afraid. And it's difficult. I mean, I think we have limited tools at our disposal, but certainly training is one of those. So again, just as the regulators become more vocal, as enforcement officials become more vocal about what they want in compliance programs, we need to continue to educate senior leadership and the board about those things. The Department of Justice is, as they're saying more than they've ever said in the past. And one of their constant messages is that a compliance program needs to have the right level of authority and independence. And they just talk about that all the time, as they should, because we all know that it's critical. So continuing to educate your leadership. But you know what, Amy, you might have better advice, because Nick's right. You're really the person who can speak to how we can influence other folks at our organizations.
Well, I had to fight this battle as well. And sometimes I was successful and sometimes not. But I tried to continually raise it without losing political capital enough to make my role, obsolete, I suppose. But I would say it's important to keep beating the drum. And there was recent language, actually, I'm going to forget his name right now, but the DOJ recently had a case where they said that they went in to do their own investigation and they were interviewing the general counsel and the chief compliance and ethics officer. And the DOJ attorney asked the compliance officer a question, and the general counsel answered and would not let the compliance officer speak. And the DOJ said that's all they needed to know about whether compliance had a voice at the table. So I would use things like that. And Joe Murphy and I are going to be doing a session in Chicago on this, around like, where's the proof and what can we use to demonstrate that our programs make a difference proactively in terms of any potential misconduct that may come up later. So I would use things like that and just say, this is important. Timing. I would try to keep it short. I remember one time I flew all the way to New York to present to the board. I was supposed to have an hour on the agenda, and right before I went in, they came out, the wrangler came out and said, okay, you've got 15 minutes. So the other thing I would say is I was prepared for that. I had my must say, my want to say, and my need to say kind of split up into three buckets. And I was able to quickly move to that. And I actually got my must out, and I got to get to my need, which was great. I didn't get to my want, but that's okay. 15 minutes is pretty good. So I would just share that you can be quick, you can be brief, but that the lack of you having a direct line is demonstrative of how the company's priorities are set, and that the outside doesn't trust. They really look at the facts. Do you directly have a voice or not? That's a yes or no question. Do you have access? I would just keep trying in all the positive ways that you can, again, without getting on someone's bad side, because that's something you have to judge in terms of the system that you're operating in. Some systems, as I've come to think of them, just won't go your way. And then you have to find, okay, what's my sandbox is how I think of it. What do I really have to play with here? What is my influence scope here? And how much is in my control and how much is not? And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you really don't feel like you're making a difference, that's when I would look to leave.
That's great advice. grabbing that DOJ guidance and asking those questions. Again, we have to kind of push our way into some of these conversations. It's a lot easier said than done, of course, because to Amy's point, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But while we're on this slide, there's a great question here that says, what is your recommendation on speaking with leadership on justifying a separate C&E risk assessment from an ERM? And you kind of touched on that a little bit, but let's boil down, like, what is the argument we make to leadership? Because that, from a distance, they might say, well, this seems totally redundant. How is this going to move the needle for us?
I think that, what Amy said previously about the nuance that you need for a compliance risk assessment that's valuable, that you really don't get from an ERM process. But having said that, if you're getting some pushback, a lot of organizations build a compliance and ethics risk assessment on sort of the foundation of the ERM process. And that can work really well as well. You can go to the ERM interviews and ask your compliance questions during those interviews so that you're not sort of duplicating the effort of the interview process. If ERM has focus groups, go to those and ask your compliance and ethics questions during those sessions. It's absolutely okay. I think you're not going to get all the information you need from an ERM process, but if you can tie into that, piggyback off of that, then that might be a helpful approach for your organization. And it works quite well at some places. So shall we move on?
Yes.
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. So a little bit about the scope of the risk assessment. And I saw that Nicole Diaz had a question about and this was early on, Nicole, can we define what we mean by risk assessment? Is it an ERM type assessment, or are we doing sort of an audit to test controls? And it's really, Nicole, I would say they vary, right? So you want, and part of it is a function of, it's largely a function of what we want to get out of the risk assessment process. So I do distinguish between risk assessments and program assessments. This sort of audit assessment of testing of controls, I think of as more a program assessment, right? You have a sense of what your risks are, you have controls in place, and you're going in to see how well those work, and maybe have some opportunities to enhance your existing program. I think of that as more of a program assessment. And I distinguish risk assessment because the risk assessment is really focused on both understanding the legal and compliance risk profile and understanding how well controls are working so that we can identify some opportunities to enhance those controls. So it's a little bit of a combination of those things. And I think what your question, I thought about your question as I looked at this slide, because this is really where we're deciding what the risk assessment should look like in terms of the scope of the assessment. There are, for most compliance organizations, you have direct sort of ownership of a limited number of risk areas, right? You might own anti-bribery, conflicts of interest, international trade compliance, and a few other areas. But at most organizations, the compliance team doesn't really directly own environmental or health and safety, or even at some organizations, regulatory compliance, right? If you're a utility, the compliance team might not own FERC compliance. If you're a railroad, the compliance team might not own the Federal Railroad Act compliance. So what is owned by compliance varies at organizations. And one could certainly suggest that the compliance team doesn't really need to assess those risks that aren't owned by compliance, right? And that's something that I have struggled with over the years, in part because if compliance doesn't own the risk area, I'm not sure how valuable it is for the compliance team or an outside compliance lawyer to suggest changes to how the controls work in those risk areas, right? I mean, you're sort of encroaching on someone else's territory to some extent. On the other hand, based on the Department of Justice guidance and that Delaware case law and just sort of good common sense, it is really important that the compliance team understand the legal and compliance risk profile, right? You cannot advise the board, advise senior leadership on the organization's legal risk profile if you've never undertaken an assessment of what that risk profile is. So I think you need a little bit of both. I think you need to try to assess risks at a high level, global level, similar to ERM, but without all the other things that the ERM process is looking at. And that gives you your risk map. And that's a really important tool, largely as a sort of educational tool for the board and others. But you also need to be thinking about how well your compliance controls are mitigating risks in those areas that you own, and maybe in some other areas as well. Really, I mean, this is conceptually what I think is so important for in-house compliance professionals to try to get their arms around. What is the monitoring role of compliance for those risk areas that compliance doesn't own, right? And if you can define that, if you can say, okay, we don't own environmental, but we need to have some sort of opportunity to check to make sure that the environmental risk is understood and that the environmental controls are working. What should that be? That is a question that needs to be asked across the organization and signed off on by the leadership team and understood by the board. That is sort of the crux of what your compliance program is all about, right? What controls how do we monitor compliance across the legal compliance across the organization for those risk areas that we don't own and for those that we do own? So it's a lot, but okay.
No, that's a lot, but there's a lot of great stuff in there. Amy, do you have something to add here? Because I have a phenomenal question.
Okay. I was going to go to Nicole Diaz's question, which is backing up from a few slides. But Rebecca, baseline question, can we define what we mean by risk assessment? How would you sum that up?
I would say it is, with the caveat that it can vary for your organization and your organization's needs, but it is an effort to understand at a high level the legal and compliance risks impacting the organization, to define the sort of risk map of the organization, and to identify opportunities to enhance controls.
Perfect. Thank you.
So, like in management consulting, you get very good at coming into an organization regardless of the industry, and like figuring out very quickly like what matters and what's going to move the needle and what you can ignore. You, in your work, you come in and you do risk assessments, across the board, across these different industries. And maybe in your own career, you went from, one industry to another industry. What advice would you give somebody who's coming in, who, is maybe coming into a new industry, to like figure out the lay of the land quickly and really assess and confirm? You're going to have some suspicions of what you think the risks are, but like, where do you kind of start to figure out that risk landscape? Because of course, as you get deeper and deeper, it gets more nuanced and so forth. But like, how do you kind of start to figure out, which way is up?
Happy to. Do you want to take that, Rebecca, or I can?
You go ahead, Amy.
Okay. Rebecca said this before, and I agree. If you can get in a room with a couple of fantastic lawyers from your organization, you get a pretty good first cut at the risks that are prominent in the organization. The next step, I usually read the 10K. I do some research on the company. When I was joining, this is what I did to get a sense. And then I think you can get deeper as you go. Then if you're scanning the landscape and that data privacy laws are changing in certain areas and that's important to your organization, that's an issue. Healthcare obviously has its own legal and regulatory landscape. Whether you're international or a global entity, you need to then spread out there. Those are some thoughts. Rebecca, what would you add?
I think that's right. I mean, I as you said, this is maybe going to sound sacrilege, but I really think you can get a pretty good idea of an organization's legal and compliance risk by sitting and talking to lawyers from around the organization. So you want to talk with somebody who's, in the Middle East, somebody who's in APAC, somebody who's in Europe, but that gives you a good starting point, right? Because they're seeing issues come across their desk every day. They're dealing with the business side of risks. They're dealing with the legal side of risks. They really do have their hands on the pulse if they're good lawyers and they're spread around the different regions for the organization. So I think that's a great place to start. You can compile a list. Look, you don't want to be overly detailed because that is going to going to be distracting for folks, right? So you want to hit upon legal risk areas at a fairly high level. And so that's a good starting point. And then you take that list and you go to other places in the organizations. I usually go from the law department to other functions. So HR has got a different perspective on legal and compliance risks than the lawyers do. So does audit, so does finance. So you're going to the different functions. And then ultimately, I typically save the business for last.
One other thing I would add, and this is kind of dovetailing off of what Amy said, is she said, I would look at the 10K, and I think that's a really phenomenal place to start. Even if you're in a private company where you don't have a 10K, you have public competitors, and so if the percentage of compliance people that haven't read a 10K is like way too high. And that's a great spot to start. I mean, you don't have to read the whole thing. You don't have to even get into all the finance stuff, but there's a bunch
of... There's just a section. There's literally one section. It's through hundreds of pages, but you just go down there, quickly read it. Once you do it a few times, you can scan to it super quick.
Yeah, or you can Control F, find risk, and see those spots in there. But I'm just saying, if you grab a couple of 10Ks from a couple of public competitors, you're going to be much better equipped on you can build a list of issues that when you go to those conversations with the lawyers or with the general counsel or whoever, you're going to first of all sound a lot smarter than saying, so what are the risks? You're going to be able to steer that conversation a little bit better, and you're going to be able to see what the differences are between what this larger sort of more public company is facing and what the sort of idiosyncratic experience for the organization that you've stepped in. But I just think that is such a wealth of information that we can leverage regardless of the company size that we're in,
Yeah.
So,
great point.
So Nick, somebody asked, what's a 10K? Do you want to answer that?
Yeah. So it's the annual report. So every public company is required by the SEC to put out an annual report. And if you go on any public company's website, well, I mean, you can find them all over the place, but if you go on their website, there's usually a link for investors. And on that page will be all their quarterly reports and also their annual reports. And as Amy said, it's sometimes it's a 150, 200 page document, sometimes more, but which has a ton of information for any investor to be able to assess. I mean, that's all investing is, right? Investing is figuring out the risks of an organization, and if you want to put your money into that organization. And some people are looking at the financial side of it and all these different, business headwinds and all those kinds of things. So there's a ton of discussion and analysis within that annual report. And again, those are updated quarterly as well. So a 10Q is the quarterly update to that annual report.
Great. And then a comment from one of the attendees, which I think is really helpful, which is that we can't and don't know everything. It's important to join committees in areas of risk. So at your organization, you have an opportunity to learn more about that area and the people that operate it. I thought that was a really nice comment that, if there's a cyber committee, a privacy committee, an international trade committee, just insert yourself, if you can, into those meetings to understand risk a little better.
What do you think about this question? What's the difference between op risk and enterprise risk? Does ethical risk fall under the scope of ORM or ERM?
I think that enterprise risk tries to capture it all, right? And
Yeah.
Operational risks are things like, are we going to be able to get timber out of this part of the world? Are we going to, what's the climate going to be like? And how is that going to impact our ability to mine minerals or, all the different things that organizations, the number of risks are countless, right? That organizations face. So I think of those as the operational risk. Enterprise risk tries to capture everything: operational risks, legal and compliance risks, personnel related risks, et cetera. And I would say ethical issues fall under the enterprise risk because they try to capture everything, but also the legal and compliance risk assessment. That's part of what we should be thinking about as well.
Somebody just asked, is there anything, I think this is with respect to the 10K thing, anything similar for government healthcare? What would you say there? I think my answer would be to find a public company that provides similar kind of services. There's going to be at least a cursory high level overview of the risks that organization is facing. I think that's a starting point, but what would you add to that, if anything?
I think if those are the operational risk, enterprise risk tries to capture everything: operational risks, legal and compliance risks, personnel related risks, I think that's right. And then the other thing I would do is maybe look at the Office of the Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services, their website. They've issued tons of compliance program guidance in specific, sort of sectors of the healthcare world. And so go to that website, look for your guidance that's been issued for your sector, and there will be some really, typically they're trying to speak to controls, but controls related to particular risks. So I think that that's a really nice resource as well.
Great.
I think we can probably skip over this one, Nick, because Amy already talked to that. So Amy,
great.
do you want
I know we're tight on time. We've got lots of fun stuff we could talk about. Documents and data. So this gets at the scope of basic things that Rebecca and I ask for and request when we are doing a risk assessment. So helpline, other reports of suspected misconduct, investigations, of course, and then substantiated allegations, internal audit reports, the employee engagement surveys from HR that Rebecca mentioned, litigation records, very important, what's gone wrong and where, and what did the organization do about it, enforcement activity, have there been any regulatory fines, issues, things like that, and then compliance information and also information on controls that are already in place.
And 10Ks.
Yes. Terrific. And then on interviews, these are critical. Rebecca and I would say spend a good amount of time here. We're doing this right now for our client. And so we initially, 80% of any good project is in the planning, right? So ahead of time, we talk to the compliance officer, maybe the general counsel about who should be interviewed. We think about the scope and who might have what. We might have half-hour interviews or an hour or longer, depending. We might go back to some people after we've consolidated everything and realized there might be some gaps. These interviews provide an opportunity to gather information, and it's a two-way communication. So you can be coaching while you're asking the questions if you kind of structure and prepare for those properly. So it's a wonderful communication opportunity. Nick, I think, is going to be sharing top 5 tips for strategically using your risk assessment that we created just for you guys. And this program, it's like a 1-pager. So we have some information in there for you all in terms of, really leveraging this incredible opportunity. We appreciate this is a lot of time and effort and money for organizations to do this. So you've got to take it for what it's worth, because it may only come up like every 3 years, right? Is kind of an ideal if you can, but I appreciate some people have a challenge getting that. So you want to really leverage it, do a bang up job the first time, get bang of your buck, and then you get to do it again. So be prepared to be challenged. There is fatigue, around compliance and stuff, and certain groups may feel that they just did it yesterday, even though it was 3 years ago. I used to get those kind of questions. So, you've got to put your happy face on and really get in there and be a partner and just build a relationship. So Rebecca, there's some good questions in here. And I just did this with ERM. What do you mean by legal and compliance risk anyway? How am I supposed to know this? So you just kind of prepare for that. And it's winning people over is a part of this as well. It's not just going in there like an auditor, and asking the questions, right? We're relationship building because this is a longer game. And then focusing on the positive is sometimes helpful. So we don't want to feel like it's a gotcha. So there's a great reframe of this question in here, like in what areas would the company benefit from additional controls, as opposed to why don't you have a control in this area, right? So those are helpful. And then we find that interviews can be helpful in understanding the causes of risk, of course, which can be super helpful in recommending the appropriate controls after the risk assessment.
Great.
It's easy to come into these conversations and be, what I would call below the line, and pointing fingers and having this sort of blame kind of energy. We don't want to have that. To Amy's point, we're trying to build relationships, and we're trying to open up the pathways for, crowdsourcing risk intelligence at scale, which is not going to happen when people feel on their heels. And the way that you framed that question is such a, it evaporates any defensiveness, because there's no blame in that question. How could the company benefit from more controls? That's a very sort of curiosity-based question that is the antidote all the time for the defensiveness that sometimes can creep in to these kinds of conversations where people feel like they're getting grilled. That's not effective at all, especially in the context of the long game that you're talking about, Amy, where we are relationship builders. We have to have those strong relationships. Mm-hmm. People are going to come to us before there's a raging inferno. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will say the interview process really is an opportunity to build those relationships. You might not get the opportunity to meet one-on-one for half an hour or an hour with the various functional leaders, or, you know, a couple levels down from the function leader, the regional leaders. You might not otherwise have those opportunities. So they really can be, I mean, the process itself, obviously, we hope is a very important process in creating the sort of foundation for your compliance program, but also going through that process just provides terrific opportunities for compliance professionals to develop relationships with the business. And you do definitely want to have that. How can we help? You know, how can we help you do this better? How can we be more efficient for you? How can we help ensure that nobody crosses the line in these critical risk areas? So that's just an important perspective, I think, to take into these interviews. In terms of privilege, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this. We don't have a lot of time anyway. But we're outside lawyers, so we tend to conduct assessments under the attorney-client privilege unless we're in the middle of a monitorship, in which case there's no attorney-client relationship between us and the company. But if it's a client, we do tend to utilize the attorney-client privilege, and I have found that it's helpful. I think it helps, especially with interviewing senior leadership. They're more comfortable telling us the real serious issues if we're conducting the assessment under privilege. You do not have to use outside counsel to utilize the privilege. You know, you can the compliance team can conduct an assessment under the privilege as long as they are conducting the assessment at the direction of their in-house counsel, for example. So I find that it's helpful at helping people open up. And I can tell you anecdotally, I don't think I've done a risk assessment in the last 20 years in which someone hasn't said to me during the course of our conversation, well, this is privileged, right? And then tells me something really important to factor into the risk assessment. So anecdotally, I can tell you it really does seem to make a difference. But you can do it without privilege as well. That also can be very effective. And again, you don't need to use outside counsel to utilize the privilege.
Terrific.
And so we've just got a few minutes left, I think, Nick, right? So
if we want to run a couple minutes long, and if not, that's all good. This was we're getting phenomenal. I think we've had hundreds of emojis. So that's what I always go by. Hundreds of comments, which is also another indicator. So it's up to you guys. We can blow through these last couple, or we can run a couple minutes long if you're open to it.
I'm happy to keep going if folks are willing.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep going too.
Talk forever.
Yeah,
so we got
okay, great. It's a bonus episode, huh? Who loves you?
When everyone's bored. So we did get a question about whether the interviews are helpful if events have already happened. And for that, I would say, great question. And yes, I think it is, because you want to understand the cause, right? What were the controls that failed if a violation occurred? And a big part of risk assessment is understanding both violations and near misses, right? Where have controls failed and where did we almost have a problem? And that helps us understand where it's important to dedicate resources. So I do think that those interviews are also really important. I think I skipped over one here. Okay, in terms of rating risk, and this I think, Nicole, maybe gets a little bit to your question earlier about sort of what should this look like. To some extent, I would say the value of rating risk depends on the culture of the organization. We've done a lot of work for engineering and construction companies in our time, and chemical companies where you've got a lot of scientists and professionals. In that case, I find that the interviewees really take to the rating process. Like, they're interested in understanding, how, and you give them a scale and you talk them through it. So sometimes they can be really useful. At other organizations, I might just say, what do you think the top 5 legal, from this is a list, have I missed any? What would you say the top 5 are? And that can be really helpful as well. So you can do this in very different ways. I hope that's a helpful answer. And it really sort of depends on the culture, I think, of your organization as to how impactful that the trying to get people to assign 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, or high, medium, low is.
I do like, if you're doing the 1 through 5, to have no 3s. Because 3 is such a cop-out answer.
I love that.
That's a really good point. It's a good point, Nick. It's a good point. It can be used strategically, so, but
yeah. Again.
Well, great. Well, importance of granularity. We've talked about this a little bit before in the context of ERM, but compliance and ethics risks are often more local than global. We know a lot of what drives behavior is cultural, right? So it makes sense that in one area you might have a high bribery risk, but in another country you might not. Sweden's very different than Latin America. So you need to be building that into your report, and that's again that granularity that doesn't necessarily come up with ERM. So we find that it's much more effective at the local level in terms of evaluating it and then looking at the mitigation. We consider the risk in 3 dimensions: the geography and the business unit and or the product or service. And then you look at the risk area, and then what's the mitigation tools. You kind of matrix all those together on like 3 dimensions, and then look at, how are you addressing the risks? How's the training working? How's the due diligence? How's the auditing going? And you can get a really nice picture if you can get the granularity around how solid is the wall that you're putting up to help protect the company from this risk from appearing. So we highly recommend doing some granular assessments. And in terms of use,
sorry,
go ahead.
I would just interject
no
to say, don't feel like you have to have a cube for every risk area, every geography, every, just thinking about, for example, in this way, risk assessment should itself be risk-based, right? You don't need to think this through for every single legal and compliance risk area if it's not a higher level risk. So these are the kind of tools you would want to deploy for your higher level risks and perhaps only in your higher level geographies or business units. Sorry, Amy.
Definitely. No, that's a great point. I highly appreciate it. Some of the results in terms of, how have we used some examples? So some of our clients have determined whether policies are needed for a particular part of the company or whether policies need to be revised. Maybe they're not clear. Maybe we get some feedback that, gosh, there's been a lot of frequent flyer questions on this particular policy. We should make it more clear and less legalese. That certainly happens. There may be company-specific Q&A that can help make a code of conduct less abstract. I know I always put those in my Q&As, which is super helpful to draw people in because it's like the answers the what's in it for me question. Why should I care? It brings it down to the personal level, to Nick's earlier points. There's just many things. There's just some examples. I know Nick is going to be giving you all the deck of this, but there are just so many things that you can do. You can modify performance objectives. If you have the opportunity, that's a great way to partner with HR and really embed ethics into the organization. So these are just some examples of things that we've done.
Yeah, I mean, if you can change the incentive landscape of the organization, you're going to change behavior. People respond to the incentives. And, I know we couldn't go through all of those. Definitely download the deck that we'll be sending around and dive into those things because there's so many different levers you can pull. And, I think, the big message that I've received from this conversation is like the risk assessment is not some ending point. It's really the starting point. It's a starting point for a conversation. It's a starting point for strategic influence. It's a starting point to start to make changes within the organization that are actually going to mitigate these risks that you're identifying in that process.
And one quick thing to parry off of what Rebecca said a minute ago too is to keep it simple. We're giving you a lot of information right now, and we're trying to give you best practices if you have a very well funded, I think, exceptional program. I appreciate that many of you may not have these resources or may need to start out simple. So however well-intentioned, risk assessment does have the potential to become overly complex with too many criteria or models or tools that can really confuse stakeholders and lead to an unnecessarily time-consuming process. And you certainly don't want to do that your first time out, or you may not get another bite at the apple. So take everything with a grain of salt. We're doing a wide range here, as opposed to if you were our client, we would be looking at, okay, what's the maturity? What are the resources? How should we scope this? That's why scoping is such an important part, and the planning is really where everything is.
And this needs to be done with some frequency. So it's not a one and done type of a thing. You're going to iterate through it. And, I always talk about this Pareto principle because I think it's how the whole world works, but it's the 80-20 rule. And you're going to come up with 1,000 risks in your risk assessment. And a small portion of those are going to be the ones that are going to actually move the needle. And when you have the confidence that this is going to be an iterative process and you're going to be doing this, over some time period, again and again and again, it allows you to try to at least focus those efforts on the real needle movers without getting overwhelmed by, all the green, yellow, and red squares on your assessment.
Okay.
Absolutely. So last couple of slides, we really already talked about reporting the results and the value of reporting information about legal and compliance risks to the board, in part to help them satisfy their oversight responsibilities, reporting to senior management to help them satisfy their oversight responsibilities. And then, to the extent that it's appropriate to certain employees, in particular, those who you're asking to participate in enhancing controls. So important to consider who you want to report to, but definitely you want to make sure that you provide information about the results of the assessment to the board and senior leadership. And this is the last slide, just a few things to avoid. Amy talked about a couple of these already. You want to be careful not to bite off more than you can chew in terms of just making this too complicated, creating too many areas for enhancements, a whole lot of recommendations for changes to the program that you don't have the budget or resources to do in the next year. So be careful about that. Be careful about sort of risk assessment fatigue, which can happen when you're duplicating efforts from other risk management groups. And again, to the extent that it's appropriate to piggyback, that can be really helpful and can still be effective. And you want to be careful about the language that you use in your risk assessment reports, not create risks for the organization through your risk assessment process. So
yes, that would not be good. Yes.
Yeah, and that's it. So thank you so much. Oh my goodness.
Thank you so much. Round of applause for Amy and Rebecca. This was phenomenal. I don't know if you've been able to keep up with the chat, but there's literally hundreds of thank yous, great information. This was really a pleasure. I would have you guys back anytime you wanted to come back. It was really a lot of fun. And, I had really high hopes for this one and you guys blew them out of the water. So thank you guys so much. Connect with Amy on LinkedIn, connect with Rebecca on LinkedIn. Again, sign up for their newsletter. And you guys have a couple of speaking engagements coming up. I think you've alluded to. So tell us again where we can find you, to leech more of your genius. We're genius leechers around here, okay?
We're always at the SCCE conference, so we'll be in Chicago. I have 2 engagements, one with Joe Murphy on does the government really care, do government regulators really care about compliance anyways? That's going to be a fun and edgy session. If any of you know Joe, he loves asking the tough questions and I'm excited to partner with him. And then I'm doing one on negotiating what you're worth in terms of pay negotiations and status and moving forward. And then Rebecca also has a great one.
Yes, I'm going to be talking on program assessment, very similar to risk assessment. So if you want to hear more about this, please. And also we will both be at the networking hour, I'm sure, at the conference. So we love Nick's right. It's such a wonderful community of professionals and love to connect with folks at any opportunity. So hopefully we'll see some of you guys there or on LinkedIn or otherwise. But lovely session. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Hope to see everyone next week on the Ethicsverse. And for the 40% of you who have not yet subscribed to the Ethicsverse, what are you waiting for? Okay. Next week, we're going to be diving into rebranding the ethics and compliance program at Yum. And yeah, have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thanks.